thank you all for having me and for having me here, and for everybody who's helped with all of the accommodations, and Penny and Claire. I think thank you all. You all have done a wonderful job. I'm actually I'm a little nervous actually about the presenting to you. I'm an anthropologist. I've come to this mobilities work rather late in my this is my second project after I did my graduate work, which was on something quite different. But during the course of that work, I actually came to see, as an ethnographer, that things really make a very big difference in politics. So I became very interested in materiality. And I started this project in about 2010, and it's just expanded in very interesting ways. And that's when I actually discovered a lot of the wonderful work that John Uri has done and written. His books really transformed the toolbox of my analytical thinking on this project. And I think that as a result, I always find myself, and I think I mentioned this to Katrina today, I always find myself in a room where I'm often the only anthropologist there, working in this sort of mobility, even though as anthropologists we've been working on, on movement and mobilities for decades. Things like pilgrimage, migration, all of these sorts of things have been very much part of the anthropological subjects of study. But somehow I think anthropology has sort of been slow in taking on this sort of mobilities turn, largely because I think, Lynn, as you mentioned, a lot of it has focused largely on the West. Yes. And it has come out of the Anglo-American context. However, I think it has been, while you mentioned that was a limit, but I think it's also been a provocation for many of us who are working outside the Anglo-American context to really take on some of these kinds of ideas and use this toolbox in perhaps different ways. And I hope utopia is one of those things. As anthropologists, it's a troubling thing to think about, but it's also very much, and as I hope I will show through the course of this talk, that a lot of the utopias or futures, particularly in the cities that I'm working in, come out of a certain degree of auto-construction, where people are sort of creating and making certain kinds of claims that are producing multiple forms of what might be futures in these cities. So I would like to, this idea of auto-construction has been used quite a bit in housing when people talk about, in Brazil, for example, how citizens have circumvented the state and built their own housing. I actually am thinking about the taxi trade and the car as a process of auto-construction that has shifted over almost a century. So I will, and I started this project actually, about 6 years ago, and it began as a project largely on hereditary taxi drivers in the city of Bombay, who had been driving taxis since the early 20th century. They had been driving Victoria carriages, pretty much the same ones that were being driven in Britain, because mobility and automobility in India has really been framed and shaped through the colonial experience with the British. And of course, it has shifted in the early post-colonial and now what might be thought of as the globalizing moment. So my project, actually, this is part of a book project which traces the ways in which the taxi industry becomes a site to understand politics and city making in India. The project began with these drivers in 2010. I was really just looking at how particular forms of work, in this case transport work, create neighborhoods. However, because these were hereditary drivers, I found that the histories of driving were very closely connected to the past as much as they were to the future of the taxi trade. So I will give you a few vignettes. I have been living with this community of drivers, mechanics, small town car wash workers for the last 6 years, and I use this place, this community, as a place from which different aspects of the taxi trade enter and how they get translated and contested, particularly in the global moment. And we'll go on, I hope I can go on to convince people that this is something important.